Hi there, Plant Girl here. Today I thought we'd take a few minutes to just talk about soil amendments. Sometimes when I'm doing up my soil mixes and I'm doing planting videos, I'll mention different amendments that I'm putting in my soil, and then I get questions about it. So I thought we would just take a quick minute to just have a little look at the amendments that I use and talk about some of the amendments that you might hear other gardeners talk about. When I'm making my own potting mixes or seed starting mixes, I'm usually starting with a base of peat moss. That's a whole new controversy on its own, but I stand by in Canada here using Canadian sphagnum peat moss over importing things like coco coir. Everyone has their own feelings about peat moss, and that's fine. But we're going to talk about the amendments, and this will apply to whether you're adding it to peat moss or coco coir, or if you use your own homemade compost, or even if you use leaf mulch. These all are amendments that you might find people putting into all of those products. And the reason they're going to be putting them into those products is to help improve drainage and aeration. Almost 100% of the time. When I am building my mix and I have my peat moss, if I'm doing like a seed starting mix, I'm probably going to grab either Perlite or Vermiculite and add them to my peat moss. So these are both products that I will always get comments about after I've talked about them, because people are concerned about cancer and the dusts and asbestos and all this. It's really just Vermiculite that was the big problem with asbestos, and that was decades ago, and it's not a concern anymore. Both these products are mined minerals, and they're both heated and exploded to make the product that you get in your packaging. The Vermiculite at one point was coming out of a mine. It was just one mine that they discovered had asbestos in it. That mine is shut down, is no longer in use. Vermiculite is tested and regulated heavily, and you're not going to be coming across asbestos in it anymore. So there's no concern about that, no risk of asbestos in your Vermiculite that you're purchasing. Perlite and Vermiculite can both be dusty products to work with. So when you're stirring and mixing it into products, especially when it's dry, you might want to wear a mask. That's always a good thing with anything that's dusty, because those very fine dust particles can get into your lungs, and that's never good for your lungs. But that's the same as when you're working with sand or any other dusty product. So there's not any extra health risk in working with them. When I want to add drainage to soil, when I'm making like a seed starting mix, or if I'm making a mix for plants like succulents that want less water sitting around their roots and they want a more dry medium, then Perlite is what I'm reaching for. It tends to drain the soil better. It allows the water to move through and create those pockets for the water to move through the potting medium and out the bottom. It also has some good oxygenating qualities with the way that the rock has been exploded and the large areas on it. It allows a lot of oxygen around the root space without being pockets of oxygen that are going to damage the roots. So Perlite is what I usually will reach for when I'm looking to aerate my soil. It's very, very light, so it'll help make anything that you're using, like if you're using a homemade compost or something that can be a little bit heavier, this is nice to add in like containers and things, because it will make the mix that you're using a lot lighter in weight, and it's going to be lighter in the fact that the water is going to be able to move through it faster, so you're not winding up with a lot of waterlogged roots or fungus and bacteria issues from just too much moisture on the soil and around the plants, especially with seedlings. That's your Perlite. Kind of looks like tiny little broken up bits of popcorn. The next product I would reach for if I'm looking to get better drainage and aeration in my soil is Vermiculite. Now, if I just have a really heavy soil, but I'm going to be using it for plants that still want a little bit more moisture in their soil, but that the mix that I have, for whatever reason, if I'm using, again, like homemade compost and that, sometimes it can be really heavy and really moisture retentive, then a medium vermiculite such as this added to your soil can help to just get the water draining off, but it will also kind of pull in some of that moisture to release back into the soil as the soil dries out. So it can be helpful that way to kind of just help regulate soil moisture more than just draining the moisture out. It also has lots of little nooks and crannies in it, which can help with oxygenating and aerating the soil as it holds that and allows some oxygen exchange through your soil with those little nooks and crannies to hold the oxygen. Vermiculite can also be found in this very fine particulate. So when I'm using vermiculite like this, I tend to be using it to cover my seedlings. So you could use either of these and they would work just fine for covering your seedlings, and not particularly your seedlings so much as when you freshly planted seed and you want to just hold moisture right at that surface of the soil to help keep it damp while you wait for your seeds to germinate. Either of these two products will work very well for that. They, like I said, they will hold on to excess moisture and then release it back into the soil as needed. So they'll both work very well for that. You can even use them to put on top of seeds that want light to germinate. I've used them on top of things like foxgloves that don't want to be actually covered. They still tend to germinate quite well because if you can see, it kind of reflects the light. And I think that's why you can get away with that with this, whereas if you covered it with even a very fine sprinkling of soil, it wouldn't work. The benefit of covering your seedlings with vermiculite, or your seeds, I guess, it's reducing the chances of you getting that green, nasty fungus kind of layer that can happen on top of your seed trays. You know, those molds, those mildews, and just all the ickiness that can happen if you are a little bit overzealous with your watering. It'll also help hold in some moisture, so if you forget about those little seed trays for a few days, as you know, when you have seedlings that take quite a long time to germinate, sometimes, you might get busy with life and forget to water them and check on them for a few days. So if you have something like this, it can help the soil to hold on to moisture just that little bit longer without being waterlogged and help get you through. When you're reducing things like fungus and things that are growing on top, you're also helping to prevent fungus gnats, because that's what they eat, that's what they live off of. So anything that you can do to reduce those types of things and have less water sitting and pooling around will help reduce that fungus gnat population that seems to always crop up around seedling zones. So anytime you can help prevent those, it's a good thing. So that's vermiculite. Another thing that you won't hear me talk about a lot, because I don't really use it, but a lot of gardeners do, so I thought it was worth mentioning, is sand. You'll hear people talk about using sand, especially play sand, as a soil amendment. Now you can use it to put in your mixes for seed starting. It will help with drainage. I'll often find what appears to be sand in commercial seed starting mixes if I purchase it. It's heavy. It will add a lot of weight, whereas the other two products will actually lighten up your mixes as far as weight. Sand is going to make it heavier. It will allow more drainage through the soil, but I do find it also kind of holds moisture as well. So it kind of acts as vermiculite in some ways, but it's just so much of a dense, heavy weighted product that it's not really worth it to me. Something else you might see recommended about using sand in your garden is to add it to clay soils. Some people think they can add this to clay soil to help lighten it up. This is a number one, no, do not do that. Adding sand to clay soil will actually make it heavier. People think, oh, it'll help drain it. You think of sandy beach, you want to add some sandy beach texture to your clay. No, this actually makes it worse. It makes it almost like concrete. Do not ever add sand to your clay soils. There's so many more things that you could be adding to clay soils that will actually help to lighten it up. Add organic matter, number one, leaf mulch, working old leaves in the fall, compost, anything organic like that that's going to break down and become that humusy layer is really going to help your clay soil. Adding sand is going to make it worse. Don't ever do that. But if you want to add it to make a small seed starting mix, it is used. Some people use straight sand to start their seeds in. I gave that a little go. I didn't find it that helpful, and yeah, it wasn't my favorite, and it's just so heavy. So I would prefer not to be using sand in my seed starting mixes, but it won't actually hurt things if that's something you'd like to do. It tends to be cheaper than purchasing perlite and vermiculite. For my money, I think these are better products and will work better for you and give you better results. So I would rather watch around for sales and pick up bags as I can and then have them on hand. They don't go bad, so you can just pick them up and keep them on hand for when you need them. So the perlite is the white stuff that you find that kind of looks like popcorn. Vermiculite can actually be, it comes in a few different kind of sizes or whatever, but this is like the medium and this is the fine, and they're not always labeled on the bags I find here, so sometimes I just have to kind of experiment with the product I purchased, but these are the two I will find without it being labeled, and they'll work both quite well. And then you have sand. So some other things that you might hear me talk about adding to my soil are things like cinnamon. Cinnamon is something that is antifungal, antibacterial, and it can help to work it into your soil, especially with seed starting mixes. I have found it to be good for helping to keep bacteria and fungus from growing if you're having trouble with that. It's not something I use a lot anymore, but earlier on in my gardening when I was, still trying to figure out the right balance and mixes and things for my climate, that worked well for me. And if you do start to have some mold or fungus and things creeping up on the tops of your trays, a fine sprinkling of cinnamon can work well. Sometimes I'll even just mix cinnamon in with the vermiculite that I'm going to sprinkle on top of my seeds and use it that way. So that's another way to use the cinnamon. And it's just there as an antifungal, antibacterial type property, just a more natural way of doing that than, whipping out sprays and things. Something else that you might hear mentioned is lime. Like I said, I use peat moss as the base for my mixes. And peat moss in and of itself is extremely acidic. So if you're using straight sphagnum peat moss, then you will probably need to add some lime to it. Some packages of peat moss come pre-limed, so you can read the package, find out, get yourself a pH meter, test your peat moss, see what it comes out as. You kind of want that sweet spot of 6.5. So if you're not getting that, then you might need to adjust for pH, and the lime will help you to do that. So that's when I'm using lime, and it does not take very much. So read the packages carefully and measure and just add less than you think you need and mix it in really well, and then do a reading and then add more if you need. But you don't want to get it, so that it's too base either. So make sure that you're not over liming if you're adding for your peat moss. You can buy bags of peat moss for seed starting that are called like a grower's mix, I think is usually kind of what you'll find it labeled as. And sometimes they will come pre-limed and have some perlite in them as well. So you can get really large packages that way and have all of that extra stuff taken care of. Sometimes I still find I want to add a little bit of perlite to it though, if I'm finding that it's still not just draining quite as much as I'd like. One last thought here is none of these things are adding any real nutritional value to your soil. That's not what you're adding them for. The perlite and the vermiculite have very trace minerals. The sand obviously will have some trace minerals as it's kind of almost a rock dust kind of product, but you're not using them to add nutrients to your soil. They're just solely there to help with aeration and drainage and, moisture control. So hopefully that cleared things up a little bit about some of the, what I consider more common amendments that you would find with your soils and potting mixes. And if you have something to add to this, feel free to add it down to the comments. It's great to see other people's thoughts on these things, and it might answer someone else's question if you have more to add. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.